mweiss asks, why do you think that despite Russia growing more conservative in virtually all aspects under Putin, the abortion access seems relatively safe? Is it safe? This is not my expertise, obviously. So let me say a couple of big picture things that may help. Putin would not let a demographic issue to be subsumed by autonomous culture wars. Demographic issues can be subsumed by culture wars, but they are going to be culture wars couriered by the regime. There's going to be a role for the church to say particular things. The church will say these things. Some others will say some other things. That's a kind of stage culture war that's permitted. But when it comes to demographics, these are going to be couriered from the top. And if Putin thinks that one abortion policy versus another is something that he should reflect upon in terms of invading another country, in terms of invading Ukraine again, that's how he'll deal with it. He will not allow it to become a matter of, principle of faith or anything else. Secondly, Russian conservatism is quite a bit more superficial than American conservatism, for example. And American conservatives, you could accuse of delusion, like you could accuse all Americans of delusion. The United States is a culture extravagantly liable to fall into a false picture, not just of the future, but of the present, and not just of the world in the present, but of itself in the present. There are other countries with a high propensity to illusion in the West, but none higher than the United States. So whatever faction you're dealing with in the United States, you could often talk about them being self-deceived in many ways. Self-deceived not about what's true as such, but actually self-deceived about what they themselves feel and think, but they're inclined to forget that they feel and think. Russian conservatism, and much other Russian political sentiment too, is much more fake. So let's take the example of the appalling homophobic policies in Russia over the past years, really. And I mean, they really did reach a stage where you could get beaten up if you were gay and the police just wouldn't investigate. Yeah? And that's something that's inconceivable. That's not something that even the most homophobic conservative in the West would be remotely open to. The situation was very, very bad. But a lot of the people instigating these policies, a lot of the people arguing for them, didn't really believe in them, except as a kind of piece of political technology. And so what's fascinating is that you can encounter structures in Russia, for example, television stations, which are promoting, as it were, an anti-gay agenda. But in fact, you find that they are run by people who are semi-openly gay. So there is this kind of extraordinary fakeness and cynicism to it, a kind of double-mindedness, the kind of thing we discussed in our propaganda video on the main channel. So I think that there is also this, that a lot of Russian conservatism is much more transparently BS, such that you couldn't even accuse it, as it were, of self-deception or of sort of being involved in ethical nostalgia about the past, the typical things that conservatism has to appropriately answer. I'm not saying it can't answer, but I'm saying it has to. These questions don't even make sense because Russian conservatism is to a good extent just fake. And you could even take this a bit further, interestingly, and say that even the big picture views of the Russian world, Ruski Mir, the sort of thing that pop philosophers like Alexander Dugin offer, you could even say that even that's not a delusion. You could say that it's in fact closer to bullshit than delusion, because you have got to have not just a steadiness of commitment to that view, but a particular kind of sincerity about it. And there's something too fake and too theatrical about it for it to be clearly a matter of delusion is also not far from the realm of bullshit. Now, in practice, there's something else you've got to be aware of, and that's that very often in Russia, you can't get things that are prescribed by the law, by the constitution, or by whatever else, obviously. So, for instance, women have had a terrible time getting access to abortions during the COVID crisis, and there are some attempts to roll back abortion rights in Russia, which I think first came in under Lenin in 1920, and that might have been the first country to make abortion legal. I don't know if that's true. It seems to be like it would be one of the first ones. So I think that that's a little bit of what I'd say. I would not be confident to predict where this is going to go. And over and above everything we've said, you've also got to be aware that the place of the rights of women in Russian society is bad, and if anything, going backwards. John on Patreon asks, Vlad, you've spoken about the importance of not answering questions too quickly. If you were a journalist and you had the opportunity to interview Russia's foreign minister, Lavrov, or Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, what would you ask them? What 3 questions would you ask them? And what do you think about these 3 questions that I am proposing? Well, let's have a go first at John's questions and then comment a little bit. And let's answer John's questions sort of spontaneously as though we were the representatives of this Russian regime. First, dear Mr. Lavrov, here's drone footage of Mariupol from the sky. Look at all of this catastrophe and destruction. How do you explain who did this and what happened to your own citizens, Mr. Lavrov? This video, dear John or dear Vlad, is a provocation. And I have a question for you. Where were you for 8 years when people were being killed in vast numbers in the Donbass? They weren't. Where were you when Russian rights were obliterated in Ukraine for years? Where were you when fascism and Nazism took over in Ukraine? They didn't. Where were you? And what do you expect us to do when we face these problems on our border? Second question. Dear Mr. Lavrov, you can't know the behavior of your soldiers. Will you agree to an independent investigation to take a look at what went on in places like Bucha, and then would you prosecute the guilty parties? Bucha is a very offensive Western provocation. As Mr. Lavrov, that's what I want to say to you. An offensive provocation that distracts from the important mission of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. And I'm not going to fall for the provocations necessitated by the propagandistic line determined by the news corporation for which you work. Third, non-Western news outlets call this war a war. Isn't it a war, Mr. Lavrov? And if you say that it's not a war because Ukraine isn't a country, how do you deal with the fact that 141 countries voted at the UN General Assembly to condemn the invasion and only 5 voted the other way? Well, I'm Mr. Lavrov and I'm answering this question like this. We're conducting a special military operation. You want to talk to me about something else? We're not going to have an interview. This is a special military operation, but let me tell you something. We are only beginning. And this special military operation, heat wave, climate change in London, and this special military operation could easily become a war, and it's just up to us how far we expand it. So you'd better be careful what you wish for. Now, I actually think, John, that the best question in the world to ask Lavrov would be the first question Steve Rosenberg asked in that interview. And don't forget, Steve is not some random guy. He's a guy with fluent possession of the Russian language and enormous experience of Russia for many years and the rich knowledge of the many regions of Russia too. And he said, Mr. Lavrov, did you get consulted when the military operation was started? And Lavrov said, well, this is something that's between me and Mr. Putin, or it's something that's to do with the procedure of the regime. I'm not going to reveal that. That's a brilliant question. The reason it's a brilliant question is because many people believe, including Christo Grozev from Bellingcat, was highly confident of this, that Lavrov didn't know about the war until it happened, basically, until it was at least imminent. And that's a reflection of the very narrow circle that framed the policy. But it's also a reflection of something else. It's a reflection of the fact that you've now got to split off the talking heads of the Russian regime into those who just do theater and those who do theater plus a little bit of substance. So you can listen to Putin and understand that some of it is theater, but some of it is real. I mean, some of the stuff he wrote about Ukraine was stuff he was planning to do, and then he went ahead and did it. So there's no mystery there that some of that stuff is real. But when it comes to the spokesperson for the foreign ministry, Maria Zakharova, and even when it comes to Lavrov, they have now descended into such a collapse of diplomacy that they are theatrical figures. They are not really in a position to either exert any power or influence or to say anything substantive. Their role is the role of clowns. Lavrov is a clown, and therefore I wouldn't ask him any questions. That would be uninteresting. Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, is also, I think, uninteresting to speak with, but for a different reason. And he isn't a clown, but he, as it were, just mirrors Putin's perspective, but in such general terms, because he never wants to put a foot wrong, and he's very scared when he does, that he mirrors Putin's perspective in such a sort of generic way that you can't get anything meaningful out of him. So I wouldn't want to do that. But if I were a journalist and I could interrogate Putin, which I certainly don't feel like doing, but if I were a journalist, I suppose I would have to. And then my questions would probably be about how he understands the threats that Russia faces, how he understands what it means to secure Russia's future and Russia's economic stability, how he understands the transition. He'll evade all of these questions, transition that's going to come after him. And how does he understand how far he himself has changed over the years? And who you're going to invade next if you can? Are you going to invade a Baltic state? Are you going to invade Georgia? Would you use tactical nuclear weapons? And so all that you would then get out of these questions would be not the transcript, but something in between the lines that you could sense, that you could taste. Because one of the bizarre things about Putin is that he does have a very large measure of sincerity and delusion in how he goes on. Annie asks, what is your somatic emotional response to all of this? I find myself with a stomachache and a sense of nausea and anxiety. I think it's not good to watch this before sleep. I had a strong physical response at the beginning. So just to put a bit of context on how it works for me, the most physical experiences in my life are to do with art and music. And I'm sweating because I'm drinking a boiling hot tea on a really hot evening. My strongest physical responses are to art, and really nothing else compares to that. About politics, I have, and actually about just human beings doing stuff that aren't human beings in my personal life, I have a capacity that's obviously freakish to balance engagement with stability. So in a way, I think even if you ask some of the people who are watching this stuff, these videos I make, I think a lot of them, maybe women more than men, would say that one of the things I like about Vlad is that he genuinely embodies a kind of stability such that I can't imagine anything happening to our politics, anything happening to our world that would throw him to the point of not having a very grounded response to it straight away. And that's just luck, that's constitution. You can train that, I trained it, but you can't just train it. You either walk into the world like that or you don't. So I can take on a great deal of darkness without being weighed down by it. You know, we talked about Jordan Peterson on the last episode, and it's hard to say anything about him because, as I said, we've got to do this vast episode about what a phenomena he is in our culture before we can even be articulate about how to analyze and make sense of what the Peterson phenomenon is about. But one clear feature of Peterson is that he turns with his back to darkness and then begins to say how terrifying it is with his back stood to it, mentioning how back there behind him are Nietzsche and Dostoevsky revealing to us the true darkness of the world. Now, this is a bit unfair, what I'm saying, because there's an enormous history of autoimmune-mediated depression in that family. And that's a huge part of this extraordinary precarity vis-a-vis darkness that Peterson feels. But nevertheless, he is faced with his back to it, because even with his back to it, he feels it so intensely. And it's palpable that that's the opposite because I face it with my eyes wide open, and moreover, it doesn't destabilize me. Whereas Jordan is destabilized, even vaguely sort of half turning toward it, facing away from it and looking at it for a flicker of a second. So that's, again, in good part just luck and constitution, but it allows me to not feel weight when I feel tragedy and depth. And that's quite, a freakish human quality that makes you perfectly suited to be a philosopher. And I would say that I am a kind of warm, not austere, warm and delighted pessimist about the wider world and about the political world. I am somebody who enjoys what Nietzsche called the pessimism of strength. That you look at things that are bad, but you also realize that they are in a real way part of life, and that life is extraordinary. But then in private life, I'm not a pessimist. In private life, I am a completely unreflective optimist. And I have remained that even though I've experienced some tragedy in my private life. So that's the background. On to Ukraine. I think that one thing I felt is something visceral to do with this weird mythology about the Second World War in Russia. No matter how much you sort of grow out of it, you can't fully get it out of your head, the way you can't get out of your head a melody you learned when you were 4 years old. You can't get out of your head this sort of mythological picture of the Second World War, And that's true even of a kid who grew up just for 9 years in the Soviet Union. And interesting, this sort of experience was reflected for me in Israel as well, which has a kind of spiritualization of militarism, and you feel that very much as a kid too. You feel the sort of sweet precarity of your predicament. But anyway, so where am I going with this World War II mythology? I think that because of it, and it's exactly the same in Ukraine, there's no difference between Russia and Ukraine in this way, there's no difference in some other ways too. They're different cultures, but close cultures. To any Ukrainian, and I would argue to any Russian of sensibility, when the Russians invaded, it just felt like the Nazis were back or the fascists were back. So that's how I felt. So I felt like I would have been happy to participate on the Ukrainian side, health allowing, and if I was there. Now, the other thing I felt was that there's this extraordinary failure that I tried to touch on maybe in that video where I talked about that paragraph from Gogol's novel Dead Souls. There's this extraordinary sense of enormous potential that Russians have and enormously fail to realize. That's really, really real. And it's even reflected in the fact that the very best Russians are few and they're amazing, And I'm not one of them. I'm really not. I'm much less Russian than I'm Russian psychologically. I'm much more West European. But the best Russians are amazing, but they're rare. And it's a culture that's going through a slump period. And you even feel that. And you even feel that it's worse. Like in 2015, it's worse than in 1995. You can feel that if you just hop across 5 dinner tables in different parts of Russia. You feel that. So there's this extraordinary failure to realize potential, and specifically a failure to convert sophisticated achievements in other realm of culture into political achievement, And I felt responsible for that, not as responsible as I would feel for something going on in my country, which is this country, the UK, but yeah, I feel it. I feel like I'm part of a culture that's completely dropped the ball on politics. And that's why I'm having such a intense, such a detailed conversation with this community about how we are at risk of dropping our balls politically in the West. So I have this feeling that, I dropped something. When my closest friend died 10 years ago, and he is still immensely intimate with me. I speak to him every day. And it's light, and these conversations are full of laughter. But he died completely unexpectedly and suddenly at an obscenely young age, 10 years ago. And I was standing by his coffin thinking, I dropped him. I didn't drop him. I didn't do anything to drop him. But I felt like that. And I would say that about the war, I felt, 4% of what I felt with my friend. So I felt some sense that I'm part of some kind of a group belonging that massively dropped the ball. And then I think I also felt some bonk sort of, being very, very unimpressed with that loser Putin. And it's so ironic that Putin is popular in the West. And make no mistake, Putin is popular in the West. And I'm going to make a prediction, maybe I've made it already, but Putin will be more popular in 2025 in Western Europe and in Canada and in the United States than he is today if he's still in power. So Putin's trajectory of popularity is up in Europe, and he knows that. He knows that. He knows that he would win a poll in many countries if he were run off against a major political figure in that country. And we've got to be clear about that. So anyway, I felt sort of the desire to get rid of that guy too, at the physical level. And that was fleeting, but if you asked me to sort of frame it, yeah, I would say, can we just remove that guy? Just remove him at any costs. And I didn't visualize Putin being killed, but Putin being removed, handled, dealt with. And there is this term that I, in fact, have never used in my life, and now I'm in my early 40s. I'm going to use it for the first time in my life. It's the term that's sort of viral in male self-development internet culture, beta and alpha males. I've never used that distinction in my life. I don't like it, but I'll use it now in a tongue-in-cheek way. Putin's just not an alpha male. And it's not because alpha males do good things. Not at all. Alpha males can be evil. Putin is not an alpha male because he's lost his stuff politically. He just lost it and became corrupted by pathologies and persecutory fears and neuroses. He's got the psychology of a weak man who is not self-possessed. And he is weak in such a way that it simply makes it impossible for him to have adequate contact with reality. Now, are there people who could be in Putin's position and not lose it that way? Yes, but they are people who would not go into politics in the first place. So therefore, the failure rate of this kind of dynamic of authoritarians at the top of a regime, the failure rate of these authoritarians is basically 100%, especially in a fluid authoritarian regime like Russia's, So if you put anybody in Putin's place who would be the kind of person who would, at least at the start point, would want to be in that place, they would lose it. You could think of individuals who wouldn't lose it, Werner Herzog wouldn't lose it. But Werner would never want to start a political career. So nobody who would want to be on that sort of trajectory could fail to lose it. So that's what happened to Putin. When it happened, I think that some things happened in the middle of the 10s. Some things happened around 2008. Some things happened around 2012, 13, 14. He began to lose it. I'm not saying what was there before was good, but what I'm saying that what was there before was much more functional on its own terms. And now we've got plenty of political qualities that are amazing. Putin is incomparably more talented than the average leader of a European country, but he is much more screwed up, and he has been screwed up by being at the top of this weird regime for a very, very long time. Wow, this was quite a ramble. I hope it brought a bit of value. Let's look at a few questions about sanctions. Aren't our sanctions making Russia's history repeat itself, of pushing Russia into a corner? It's going to feel humiliated, it's going to sort of bounce back in some way. Are the Russian people going to have enough of it at some point? Enough of the economic hardship, enough of dead soldiers, enough of international condemnation? Do we have any trends to go on to guess when that might be? And to what degree are the Russians blaming the West? Well, a while ago, an publicly anti-war Russian YouTube channel that, for reasons of censorship in Russia, was reconstituting itself in English. I think it's a big channel. I think on the Russian YouTube they had over 1 million subs. Asked me if I could have a look at one of their videos, and if I felt it was good, maybe point out that it was worth seeing to my own audience. And I haven't watched that video in full, whatever, glance at it. I will get round to watching it. I'm just so behind with all kinds of correspondences and favors. But I know that I won't be recommending it to you guys. And that's because it tries to say that there's some kind of separation between the Russians and their government, such that it's not fair to hit ordinary Russians, many of whom are against the war, with a very harsh sanctions regime that's going to basically probably have counterproductive consequences. It's going to get Russians more agitated, more pissed off, more resentful about the West. And so the reason I'm not recommending that video to you is that I think that's a misunderstanding of what the sanctions are. I think it's wrong to be in favor or against the sanctions as such. The sanctions are an inevitable response in a context in which there is no possibility for a direct military response. Now, could the sanctions have gone less far? Could they have gone further? Yes, that's all possible. But a severe response with the sanctions was inevitable. So to say that you're against these sanctions really is a kind of pre-political statement, you know? So that's how I think about the sanctions. And that's why the question, are we doing something wrong with the sanctions, doesn't fully make sense, you see? So are the sanctions going to get more support for Putin? Yes, certainly. Are the sanctions going to make a coup more likely? Well, not in any obvious way, no. Are the sanctions going to be blamed on the West? Yes, they're going to be blamed on the West by the majority of the Russian population, not on their government. Moreover, I think that the basic response for Russians over the years to come, ordinary Russians, especially Russians not in Moscow or in Petersburg, will be, our life is getting tougher. This is difficult. Why is this happening? Okay, let's watch a bit of TV, a bit of radio. It's the evil West. Okay. Well, I mean, what can we do? I mean, you know, they must be doing something in the Kremlin about this. I don't know what they're doing. They could be useless. I mean, they're not useless. Who knows? Well, anyway, this Western stuff is all bad and it's trying to somehow get us. And we're poor, really poor as a result. Ah, damn it. So that's going to be where most Russians are at. So no, the sanctions are not going to strategically achieve anything for us except to prevent Russia from engaging in another conventional war. Will the sanctions affect how this war goes? Well, it's not my area to discuss that, but not anytime soon. So therefore, it's kind of in the realm of a necessity that that's how we should frame it, not in the realm of are you for it or are you against it. What would it mean not to impose the sanctions? If the West didn't impose the sanctions, it would be an intolerable expression of weakness. So it's just not a feasible position. So it's kind of indulgent and not political enough to say I'm in favor or I'm against the sanctions. The sanctions are there. So I think we have basically covered all of these questions. The capacity of Russians to tolerate hardship is great, and greater hardship will absolutely not be linked to questioning of their regime. It just won't be. So pessimistic picture here, but again, my advice is break out of this for or against the sanctions debates. John from Brisbane, hi John, asks, could it be that these men who are sent to the front, picked from poor areas of the country, from ethnic minority areas of the country, could it be that they're not just sent to the front because they're just meat that needs to be used to make progress? Could it be that they're sent to the front because Putin wants to get rid of them? So just like Russia ethnically cleansed, for example, the Chechens in the middle of the 20th century under Stalin, deported them, that something like that is happening again to populations internal to Russia. Is it possible that this is some kind of a quasi-genocidal enterprise to get rid of undesirable people in the Russian Empire? No, not at all. The real reason this is happening is that it's not a choice that these are the folks who have to go to the front, John. Because if you started receiving coffins in Moscow and in Petersburg en masse, there would be a problem for Putin. This would be unstable. And Putin, just like the Chinese regime, is obsessed with avoiding instability. Only Putin, of course, is now an actor who can produce profoundly counterproductive consequences for himself. But nevertheless, he still thinks in terms of minimizing instability. And so the more privileged bits of the country will be the bits of the country he will turn to last for mobilization. That's beginning to happen a bit because they're running dry. I mean, they're running out of men. But it's still not happening en masse in Moscow and Petersburg. Putin's basic aim, John, is that there is no war as far as Moscow and Petersburg are concerned. And yes, there is a war as far as other parts of the country are concerned, but that's less important. Frans asks, could you say that the Putin regime is a renaissance of totalitarian regimes like that of Stalin? Frans, I think that I've tried to give an answer to that in a couple of the videos. So I'm going to use this opportunity to give us an update on where we are at today with this totalitarian or fascist turn that Putin made after the war. Russia came into the war as a kind of hybrid authoritarian regime. By hybrid, we just mean that it's an authoritarian regime that spends more time mimicking authoritarianism than implementing it. And since the war, I started using a bizarre term that I came up with when I was recording one of the videos, which I called pointillistic totalitarianism. I spoke about pointillistic authoritarianism too, but pointillistic totalitarianism is to create sort of little bubbles, little lanes in which you do take a totalitarian approach, but that does not percolate all the way through the institutions, all the way through society. So that's what's been happening. So I see Russia as having taken a 15 to 20% totalitarian or fascist, if you like, turn. Fascism is a word that needs a bit of definition. I give it a little bit of definition in the video on fascism, but it risks being a vacuous word. But that turn happened, and since that turn happened, I think what our update should say is that Russia has gone in a totalitarian direction more, but at an incredibly slow, incremental tempo. So we went boom, like this, almost overnight, almost in a period of a couple of weeks, really, from pretty much a hybrid authoritarian regime to a regime with elements of fascization, elements of totalitarianism. But after that, boom, after that arrow going a quarter of the way there, it stopped, and now it's moving sort of 0.1% a week in the wrong direction. So could this rapidly accelerate at some point? Yeah, history tells us that that's possible, but it's unlikely, I think, because as much as Putin wants a little bit more mobilization from his population, and by mobilization I mean political mobilization, not military mobilization, he wants demobilization, political demobilization even more. That's for him a prerequisite for stability, that most people say, look, I'm not going to get into politics. I'm going to outsource my politics to Putin. He wants to invade Ukraine, let him do it. He wants to take over bits of Ukraine, let him do it. He wants to pull out and give the Donbass to Ukraine, whatever he does, let him do it. I'm going to outsource my politics to him. Now, we've got to watch this, and this could change on a kind of 3 to 6 month period. But at the moment, you couldn't call Russia a totalitarian society by any means of the imagination, really. It's partially there, but that's about it. Now, there are a million contrasts and similarities with different ghastly regimes of the past. I think one interesting feature of the Stalin regime is that nobody was safe. The elite weren't safe at all. In fact, the elite of the elite weren't safe. And that wasn't true in Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, to a very great extent, there were certain people in top positions who knew that if they stayed in the correct lane, they were relatively safe. That's quite an important difference. It actually interestingly means that some of the evil done in the Soviet Union was done under more duress than some of the evil done in Nazi Germany. At the moment, the position of the elite in Russia is that they are safe so long as they stay supporting the regime. They're not just going to arbitrarily be taken away. But at the same time, interestingly, we are reaching a point where you can't just resign as a member of the Putin government, of the Putin regime. You do risk something bad happening to you and your family. That's kind of a gesture at an answer. I hope it's helpful. I do look forward to saying more about this. Our last question from X is probably really important to a small minority of you watching. So it's important that we don't condescend to it. And X says, look, I'm not a fan of Putin, not a Putin fanboy, and I feel torn by this war, and I've watched all of your videos. But I'm confused by the history here. In 2001, Putin seemed to be friendly with Bush and was there for Bush. And then the West seemed to get involved in Ukraine. We can talk about the extent to which that's true. And I just find the reaction to different opinions on this war absolutely mind-blowing. Presumably that it's sort of unutterable to be even partially sympathetic to Russia. NATO is gang warfare on the international stage. I am a German and I feel so wrong about how Russia has been alienated. Learning what I have from your videos about Russia, it seems to me that Russia was the last country we should have alienated. P.S. It seems to me that the US and the UK are sacrificing Ukraine in order to bring Putin down. I am worried that this strategy may lead to nuclear war. I feel overwhelmed navigating between Putin's lies and Western lies. So, what I feel is that sometimes a thing is not about the thing that it says it's about. And I don't want to respond to your comment X politically, because I think that to a lot of your questions politically, there are partial answers you can find, and some of them are even on my videos. But I think that there's also real space for taking a break from politics, not following it, and sort of buffering yourself away. There's always, of course, also room for therapy when that's appropriate. And let me say why I'm saying this. Because in this comment, what I am feeling is a kind of view of power and institutions and political authority and the people who make all the decisions who you can't see and maybe can't even influence or touch. A view of them that's a bit magical. And what it's like is a child's view of adult capabilities. And that's why ethically, obviously, I can't say anything that's of therapeutic value to you. But ethically, it's not right for me to answer this question politically. Because there is a little bit of intensity and claustrophobia and persecution here in these words that makes me feel, you know what, forget about that politics for a bit and see what you can do. Looking in, seeing in, getting support with that, moving forward with your life in various ways, and maybe being readier to engage with all of this politics, when you're readier to do it and it makes you less overwhelmed?